Welcome to Creative Connections, connecting the creative, creatively connecting everything else. Today we're on the South Downs, at Chanctonbury Ring, that familiar crown of beech trees on the West Sussex skyline, and one of the area's most atmospheric hilltops. It sits just beside the South Downs Way, so walkers following the chalk ridge pass very close to it. But Chanctonbury Ring is not just somewhere you pass, it's the kind of place that pulls you towards it.
Last year, on the longest day, we walked up to Chanctonbury Ring in the early evening so we could reach the ring before sunset. The path climbs steadily between fields, open downland and stretches of trees, and you begin to get that sense the South Downs often give you, that you're leaving the everyday world behind without going very far at all. The sky begins to widen, the wind becomes more noticeable, and then eventually a clump of trees come into view ahead of you.
That very distinctive ring of trees.
Yes, you see them from miles away. That's part of what makes Chanctonbury so distinctive. It's not hidden. It's not tucked away in a valley or buried in woodland. It sits openly on the West Sussex skyline, visible long before you reach it. And we'd gone there thinking, rather naively, that we might be alone.
Which, on the longest day, was optimistic.
Very optimistic. But it wasn't crowded. That's what I liked. It wasn't a festival atmosphere. It wasn't noisy or organised. It was just a small gathering of 20 people or so who'd all had the same thought. Families, friends, a few people sitting quietly on the grass, some standing and looking out. Everyone turned in one way or another towards the setting sun.
Where was the sun going down from there?
Broadly to the northwest, towards the western South Downs and the far edge of the Weald. From Chanctonbury, the views open out in different directions. To the north, you look across the Sussex Weald. To the south, the land falls away towards the coast. But that evening the focus was northwestward, where the sun was slowly dropping. And it was beautiful. There was something about sitting there on the grass with other people scattered around, all watching the same thing, that made it feel connected to something much older.
As if people had been doing that there for a very long time.
Exactly. That was the feeling. And I remember thinking, this is why places like this become meaningful. Not necessarily because someone declares them special, but because people keep being drawn to them. A high place, a wide horizon, the longest day, the turning of the year, the sun going down. It felt ancient.
And yet one of the things you discovered afterwards was that the part most people recognise, the trees, is not ancient in the way you assumed.
Yes, and that genuinely surprised me. I'd always vaguely assumed that the trees were part of the ancient story. Not literally every individual tree, of course, but the idea of a ring of trees on that hill, I thought that must go back deep into the past. But it doesn't. The famous crown of beech trees was first planted in the 18th century, around 1760, by Charles Goring of Wiston House. He was only about 16. A teenager looked at that hilltop and decided to plant trees on it.
Which changes the way you see it.
It does, because suddenly the thing that makes Chanctonbury so recognisable, that dark crown on the skyline, becomes a much more recent layer. The trees are not the Iron Age part. They're almost modern compared with the hill beneath them.
So what was there before the trees?
An open chalk hilltop, wind, grass, sky and the older earthwork. In the Iron Age, or possibly at the very end of the Bronze Age leading into the Iron Age, Chanctonbury wouldn't have looked like a wooded ring. It would have been an enclosure on the ridge of the South Downs, a bank and ditch, roughly circular, sitting high on the downs. The trees soften it now. They make it feel enclosed, mysterious, almost like a grove, but the original monument would have been much more exposed.
So less woodland, more open hill fort?
Yes, although even the word hill fort can be slightly misleading. When we hear fort, we tend to imagine a military place. Soldiers, defences, attack, retreat. And some hill forts certainly had defensive uses. But many of these sites seem to have had more complicated roles. They could be places of gathering, places for stock, markers of territory, centres of exchange, symbols of power, or places with ritual significance. Often we don't know exactly which.
What does the evidence at Chanctonbury suggest?
The earthwork itself tells us that people deliberately enclosed the hilltop. There's a bank and an outer ditch and an entrance on the eastern side. Pottery and pits suggest activity in the early Iron Age period, though later reassessment has pushed some thinking back towards the late Bronze Age. But the more interesting thing to me is that the hill seems to have mattered before the enclosure was built.
In what way?
There have been earlier prehistoric finds, flint tools, including things like a polished flint axe, an arrowhead, scrapers, and other pieces. There are also Bronze Age objects and barrows nearby. So even before the hilltop was enclosed, Chanctonbury and the surrounding downs already seem to have mattered to people.
And when you say barrows, what exactly are they? Is that what tumuli means on an Ordnance survey map?
Yes. A tumulus is a burial mound, and tumuli is the plural. So when you see tumuli marked on the map, you're looking at ancient burial mounds in the landscape. Around Chanctonbury, there are several of them along the ridge. Some have produced little or no evidence, but one mound to the west revealed the burial of a woman in her early 30s. She'd been buried with a bronze dagger, and there was also evidence of a cremation nearby. So even before the hilltop was enclosed, this hill and the surrounding downs already had a connection with burial, memory, and ritual.
That does help explain why the atmosphere feels so strong.
Yes, or at least why the feeling doesn't seem to come from nowhere. There are places where the atmosphere comes mostly from the setting. Chanctonbury has that, certainly. But it also has these older traces of human attention. People used the hill, they marked it, they buried people in the landscape around it. Then later they enclosed the hilltop. And that wasn't the end of the story. Much later, the old earthwork seems to have drawn people back again.
In what way?
About 500 years after the earlier enclosure seems to have gone out of use, Chanctonbury was used again in the Roman period. At least 2 Romano-Celtic temples were built inside the old earthwork. So this wasn't just an abandoned earthwork left on the hill. The Romans, or Romano-British people living under Roman influence, came back to it and gave it a new religious or ceremonial purpose.
Do we know what kind of rituals took place there?
Not exactly. One of the more unusual finds was a concentration of pig head and jawbones, which may suggest that pigs or boars had some ritual significance at the site. But even without that, the temple buildings themselves tell us something. This wasn't just someone casually camping on an old hilltop. There were structures, wall footings, roof tiles, window glass, pottery, coins, oyster shells, even evidence of decorated surfaces.
Oyster shells?
Yes, which is one of those details that suddenly makes the past feel oddly alive. You imagine this high place on the downs, exposed to wind and weather, and then you have these very human traces, food, offerings, fragments of daily life, fragments of ceremony.
So by the Roman period, Chanctonbury may already have been ancient.
Very ancient, and that's important. To the people using it in the Roman period, the bank and ditch may already have seemed old. They weren't building on a blank site. They were reusing a place with its own earlier memory. And that happens again in the 18th century, when Charles Goring plants the beech trees. He wasn't creating Chanctonbury from nothing. He was adding another layer to an already old place.
A teenager beautifying an ancient monument.
Yes, and the story is memorable. A 16-year-old from Wiston House planting beech trees on the hilltop. Some versions say he carried water up the hill himself to help them survive. Others say servants carried it. Either way, the result changed the identity of the place. What began as a planted ring of trees gradually became a familiar landmark on the Sussex skyline.
Because now, for most people, Chanctonbury Ring means the trees.
Exactly. Many people probably think the ring is the ring of trees. I did. But the name points to something older, the earthwork on the hilltop, the bank and ditch made by prehistoric people when they enclosed the site. The beech trees came much later. They didn't create the ancient ring, but they made it visible from miles away.
And then the trees themselves became part of the mythology.
They did. Once you have a dark clump of trees on a lonely hilltop, visible for miles, people will tell stories about it. Chanctonbury has plenty of folklore, Local legend has it that it was created by the devil and that he can be summoned by running around the clump of trees 7 times anti-clockwise. There are ghost stories, fertility legends, strange noises, as well as unsettling experiences. Some of that can feel fanciful, but folklore often grows around places that already feel charged. The stories may not be literally true, but they tell us something about how people have experienced the place.
Because it does feel different up there.
It does. Even in daylight, even with walkers going past, Chanctonbury has a particular atmosphere. I don't find it frightening or unsettling. It feels strangely welcoming but not ordinary, slightly electrifying, as though the past is still very close to the surface, still somehow present.
That's a good way of putting it.
And on the longest day, that contrast becomes even stronger. You're beside a ring of trees that was planted only a few centuries ago, sitting on an earthwork that may be more than 2,500 years old, watching the sun go down over a landscape people have been looking out across for many thousands of years.
So you feel several different periods of history at once?
Yes, that's exactly what it does. The 18th century is there in the trees. The Roman period is there in the temple, remains beneath the ground. The Iron Age is there in the bank and ditch. The Bronze Age is there in the wider landscape of barrows and old tracks. And then there's the present, people with picnic blankets, children running about, friends sitting quietly, someone taking a photograph, someone just watching. All those layers sit on top of each other.
Chanctonbury Ring is nearby too, isn't it?
Yes, Chanctonbury Ring is to the southwest, above Findon and not far from Worthing. It's much larger, and it reminds us that Chanctonbury was not an isolated place. These hills were connected by routes, sightlines, earthworks and settlements. People moved along the South Downs Ridge. They used high ground. They marked it.
So it's not just one mysterious clump of trees.
No, it is part of a much bigger landscape. And that matters because when we visit these places now, we often arrive as individuals. We walk up from a car park along a footpath and see it as a place apart from ordinary life. But historically, Chanctonbury was part of a network. Tracks, ridges, barrows, enclosures, temples, fields, grazing land, routes across the South Downs.
A place people pass through, return to, look towards.
Yes, and perhaps that's why people are still drawn to it. You don't need to know the archaeology to feel that the place is unusual, but once you do know it, you see the hill differently. Because you realise that Chanctonbury's power doesn't come only from the trees. In fact, the trees almost mislead you.
Because they look like the ancient part.
They do, and perhaps that's the key to the place. Chanctonbury isn't one ancient thing preserved unchanged. It's a place that's been used, altered and reimagined again and again. It's been a prominent hill on the Downs, a prehistoric enclosure, a Roman sacred site, grazing land, an 18th century landmark, a place of folklore, and then a place damaged by the Great Storm of 1987 and replanted afterwards.
What happened to the ring in the Great Storm?
In October 1987, many of the trees were brought down. For people who knew the ring before the storm, that must have been shocking, because Chanctonbury's silhouette was part of the local identity of the South Downs. However, the storm also allowed archaeologists to look again at parts of the site that had been hidden beneath the trees. During the replanting, there were new opportunities to investigate the earthwork and the ground around it. And the replanted trees are still maturing, so the ring we see now is not exactly the one people knew before the Great Storm of 1987. And of course, all of it is very different from the open hilltop enclosure of the Iron Age.
So even the landmark is changing.
Always. That is what landscapes do. They seem permanent because they outlast us, but they're always changing. The chalk wears. Trees grow and fall. Paths shift. Names survive, stories attach themselves, archaeology disappears underground, then a storm or a plough or an excavation brings something back to light.
When you sat there on the longest day, did knowing all this afterwards change the memory?
Not really. At the time, I thought the trees had always belonged to that ancient hill. Now I know they're a much later layer, but that doesn't make the place feel less powerful. If anything, they draw your eye to the hill and everything beneath them.
So the trees turned the hill into something people could recognise from miles away.
Yes. And that brings us back to Charles Goring, because whether he intended it or not, planting those trees made the old ring visible in a new way. It gave the hill a shape people could recognise from a distance. A crown, a circle, a dark mark against the sky.
That's what makes it so distinctive.
Exactly. From a distance, it's the trees you notice first. But when you walk up there, the place isn't just about the trees. You become aware of the ground itself, the bank, the ditch, the paths through the ring, and the older hill beneath them.
There's something interesting about the longest day in particular. It's not just a sunset, it's the turning point of the year.
Yes, the summer solstice is both a peak and a beginning of decline. It is the longest day, but after that the days start to shorten. That gives it a strange mixture of celebration and melancholy. You're watching the sun at the height of its power, but also at the moment when the year turns. And on Chanctonbury that feeling is intensified.
So perhaps that's why other people had come up too, to mark it in their own quiet way.
Yes, nobody needed to explain why they were there. A few people had come up to the hill on the longest day, simply to watch the sun go down. And perhaps that's not so different from what people have always done. We go to places like Chanctonbury Ring at certain moments in the year. We watch the light change, we notice the seasons turning, and over time, those places begin to gather meaning.
And Chanctonbury still seems to matter to people in that way.
Yes, you can go there simply for a walk and the view, and that would be enough. But at sunset, especially on the longest day, it feels like more than a place to admire the view.
So even if we can't know exactly what it meant to people in the past, we can still see that it mattered.
Yes, the traces left in the ground tell us that much. What we cannot know is how it felt to the people who used it, whether they felt anything like the atmospheric charge I felt sitting there on the longest day.
And that brings us back to the sunset.
Yes, when we sat there last year, watching the sun go down towards the northwestern sky, we were just doing something very human, walking up to a high place to watch the light change. But beneath us was the bank of an old enclosure. Somewhere below the grass were traces of Roman temples. Around us were trees planted in the 18th century, damaged by storms, replanted and still growing. And nearby were older tracks, barrows and marked places along the South Downs. So the feeling was not imagined. It came from being in a place where so many different histories seemed to be present at once.
And from the fact that people are still drawn there.
Yes, on the longest day, as the sun slipped lower and the grass darkened, the small gathering on the hill felt like part of a much older pattern, people being drawn to Chanctonbury for reasons we can only partly understand, or perhaps don't need to understand. And when the sun finally dropped away, Chanctonbury became a silhouette again, a dark ring on the skyline, recent trees on an ancient hill.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode of Creative Connections, come back next time and we'll draw a new map of connections. Wherever you're watching or listening to this podcast, please like, subscribe or follow, because it helps us keep the channel going and build even more creative connections.